Elevator shaft. This is a photo that I took in a four-story hospital building. The building was put up in the late 30s, and I go to a lot of abandoned places. This one was made with a lot of reinforced poured concrete, so the structure was pretty sound. It's been there for so many decades and still is in pretty good shape. When I'm shooting interiors, the lens on my camera, this was taken with a Canon DSLR, and the lens that is there on interiors most of the time is a 16 to 35. That's about as wide as you can get, the 16 millimeter for a full-frame Canon DSLR. In this case, down at the bottom of this elevator shaft, the wide-angle setting makes the skylight very, very small. So I took it with sort of the other end of the scale and used it at about 35 millimeter setting. I did not get low down to get this photo. With the camera pointed straight up, if you can get away with it, it helps to extend the tripod as high as you can so that you can preview what you're getting without actually getting down on your hands and knees in the muck. So with this shot, after I found the composition I wanted, I took a light and dark exposure so that I'd have both the walls of the shaft and the skylight details. If I needed, for this shot I didn't do this, but if I needed detail in the foreground, I would have taken a third exposure using manual focus so that I'd have be able to reflect nearby detail. I shoot raw so that I can fine-tune the highlights and shadows as I do the photoshopping. I like to shoot at the lowest ISO to keep noise down, so almost all of my interior shots use a tripod because the exposures get kind of long. Why black and white? I'm looking at the original shot in Photoshop now, and the walls are sort of a putty color, leaning a bit to the green. The bundle of pipes, the narrow diameter pipes that are in the center, they're a bit rusty, and rust does respond pretty well to slight tweaks in saturation and contrast. But I didn't like the idea of just the rust being colorful in an otherwise monotone kind of shot. So in Photoshop, I click the black and white button. They sort of have a one-button thing that lets you see black and white. And that lets me know just in a second whether or not the black and white is a good path to pursue. And in this case, it was confirmed. It looked promising. And so then I don't leave it there because the black and white button sort of, what I want to do is I put a couple of hue saturation layers over my photo so that I can use the slider controls on the hue particularly to have a lot of control over the lightness and darkness and get that exactly the way I want. And the purpose there is to emphasize shape and depth. So that's what I use those sliders so that I can really sort of dial in exactly what I want to see in the shadows and the highlights. Now looking back at this, as I did my photoshopping, I wondered where is the elevator? I mean, I was down at the bottom of the shaft and we're looking out the top, and there is no elevator. So that's a mystery I did not solve. We can only guess about that. So that is more or less what I've got to say about the elevator shaft picture. A picnic table. If you drive to Albany and take the Northway halfway up to Canada, that's where you'll find what's left of Frontier Town. This is a tourist attraction that opened up in the 60s and closed in 1998. So this particular picnic table sat out in the elements for a few decades before I came by to take its picture. If you're a tourist and you're visiting Frontier Town and get hungry, you've got a couple of choices. On the main street in Frontier Town, you can buy something to nibble on at the general store, or you can get burgers and fries at the snack bar. Frontier Town doesn't want you to eat your own sandwich at their picnic table. This particular picnic table sat outside the office and maintenance shed behind the scenes for staff use. I took the photo with a stellar plastic camera. That's a Diana clone. The original Diana cameras were made in Hong Kong, came out in the 60s. Camera Wiki on the web tells me that there's something like 80 versions of the Diana camera, and they're all virtually identical except for the name on the camera. Most of them were produced in the 60s and 70s. Recently, newer as plastic cameras have become more popular, they've come out with sort of newer versions of them, but this was one of the original, more primitive ones. They have a plastic lens, a shutter adjustment that doesn't really seem to adjust anything, and a focus ring that lets you focus as close as 4 feet. My Diana clone, the Stellar, came from a yard sale. I paid something like $3 for it. Crudeness is written all over these cameras, and I like that. The crudeness is on display in the photos too. The plastic lens takes photos that are sort of flat, lacking in contrast. And even when you're on target with the focus ring, parts of the image are blurry, especially around the edges. You can see that. Part of the appeal for me of using this kind of camera is a surprise. I took the photo of the picnic table with my Canon DSLR-2, and to tell you the truth, in the digital shot, the lushness of the weeds poking through the rotting tabletop, that adds an element of irony to the photo, and I like that. But I favor the black and white shot because removing color and adding the primitive artifacts makes the photo completely bleak, which is really, picnic tables are generally a happy thing, and to see one so sad, that has appeal for me. Arrow. They've got this term, user-friendly. And my word for pinhole cameras is the opposite, user-antagonistic. Pinhole photography uses a phenomenon of physics or optics where light entering a darkened area through a tiny hole will project an upside-down version of the scene outside of that darkened area. If you put a piece of film inside that darkened area, you get a picture without needing a lens. Focus, you can't do it. Although, if you want to get into the details, you can optimize pinhole size and distance from the film to sort of maximize sharpness. But my way of looking at it is that all parts of the pinhole photo are equally fuzzy, and if you want to maximize sharpness, get a real lens. Because you don't get detail in pinhole photos, you have to seek subjects that let you see broad shapes with contrast, and that's why when I had this particular camera loaded with film, I sought out this building corner, which you can find on East School Street in Woonsocket. So here's the camera. A lot of people punch their aperture, if they're making a pinhole camera, they punch their aperture in a little piece of flattened out aluminum soda can. And for this camera, considering what I was working with and where I wanted to go, I covered the whole front of the camera with the flattened out can. I wanted a camera with a curved film plane, so it'll be flat in the front, and where the film sits, it would actually go around in a semicircle. So I started out with a round wooden box with a lid on it that I bought at Michael's Art Supplies. And I cut that box in half, and in front of it I glued a thin piece of plywood to, in essence, hold the pinhole. The lid doesn't fasten tight, so I need to tape the lid down after I load the film. It takes 120 film, which I cut to length in a dark bag. This is a one-shot camera. That's what I mean with sort of user-antagonistic. You take one picture, and then you have to get the dark bag out and remove your exposed film and put a fresh piece of film in. And by the way, you have to cut your film to size inside the dark bag, so you have to do that. You have to develop a technique for getting a piece of film the right size to fit into the camera properly. With another element that's sort of puzzle about using a pinhole camera is exposure. You can see on this one there's a black piece of tape that actually covers the pinhole. And when you are ready to take your shot after you've aimed the camera, and by the way, there's no viewfinder on this, you sort of just have to aim it at what your subject is and hope you got it in there somehow. You lift up the tape and count the seconds. So generally, I take 3 exposures. I bracket pretty broadly. I'll take one at 5 seconds, one at 15 seconds, one at 45 seconds. And when I get the film developed, if that doesn't sort of, if none of them work, those 3 exposures will actually give me some direction about which way to head in terms of more exposure or less exposure. And here you can see sort of a byproduct of developing your own film. Dust is the enemy for people who develop their own film. And when you have a pinhole camera like this one, where there's a lot of chances for the film to pick up dust along the way. So dust is and specks on your picture are sort of part of what comes with it. The dust specks can be removed in Photoshop, but for this shot I left them in there for 2 reasons, really. One of them is sort of a symbol of what I went through to get the shot. It sort of expresses some of the agony in working with a pinhole camera, and also as a salute to the primitive technology I used. So here we have a shot taken with a homemade pinhole camera.